Aundi, I am so excited that you are here to celebrate with us. I asked Aundi to be here today. She is a therapist and a writer. Her book, Try Softer, is just so lovely and um, so helpful in a way that's not like, I feel like a lot of times we pick up a book from a therapist and we expect it to be like personal development, hard work, dig in. And your book is like the opposite of that. Your book is like a big, deep hug and a deep breath and like a release. So thank you for all that you do. So I asked Aundi here today to have a little bit of a conversation about what does it mean to honor our limitations? Because today's first episode, Relaunching Sucker Punched, is all about honoring our limitations. So Aundi, when you hear the phrase honoring your limitations, what comes to mind? What do you think of?
Yeah. Well, first, I just want to say thanks for having me. And I love that you're talking about this and you're encouraging other folks to think about this, because it seems, maybe for some people, it might seem almost basic, like people have limits. And there's a sense in which that's almost like, well, yeah, obviously, right? But so many of us, particularly if you have a history of trauma, but it doesn't only have to be if you have a history of trauma. I mean, we are really in a culture where we are raised to not listen to our bodies. Like, we are praised for bypassing our limits. We're praised for, going beyond what often is actually good for us. And I think there's two sides of that, right? Like, it's not to say that there's not value in discomfort, right?
Yep.
There is that space in which we push a little bit more, and then we experience growth.
Yep, totally.
But unfortunately, we often lose the nuance. It's like, what is it? What's the quote? It's like, if you're not first, you're last. It's like that. Well, what's his name? It's the Talladega Nights. Anyways,
there we go. Ricky Bobby, right? Is that what it is?
Yeah. It's like this idea, like, where it totally lacks nuance, because there's so much more to life than that. And if we're always bypassing the information of our bodies in order to look like we matter or we have success, to somehow retain connection or relationship with people, in the short term, like, that can be a strategy that can help us survive. Sometimes we don't have a choice. But when we get a moment, when we have the safety, when we have the space to step back and to say, hey, is this like what I want? Is this how I want to live my life?
Yeah, totally.
And I always think of boundary work, really, when we can do the best, deepest boundary work, comes from a core sense of who you are, your own body's ebbs and flows, your needs and your wants, and all of those things. And obviously, we're not going to ever do it perfectly. But if we can set our boundaries from an internal knowing, we're setting them from a place of wholeness. And we're not doing it like it's a punishment. We're not like, oh, well, that person, I need to set a boundary. I mean, it's not to say we don't need to set boundaries with folks sometimes, but the most life-giving boundaries often come from knowing, like, listen, like, here's what I can do. And so someone then asks you, hey, I have this need that goes beyond what I can do. If I can come back to the place of, like, man, I would really like to help, but I can't. That truly goes outside of my limits. That gives us this framework of saying, like, it's not about, it takes it out of that space where it's like, oh, I'm bad if I don't give you what you want, or, oh, I can't believe you even asked me.
Yeah, right.
Instead, it's like, oh gosh, I want good for you.
Yeah.
But I'm not able to provide, what you're.
Yeah. I think that right there is such a key. I talk in the episode that released today. I share a story about sitting in therapy and just being like, why can't I be awesome at everything all the time? Like, and just this, like, I'm either perfect or I'm a complete failure. And like
Mhm.
seeing any limitation as failure and resenting my humanity, right? If we're human, we have limitations. And because I have limitations, I must be a failure. And therefore, being human must be a failure, right? And like, I mean, there's some like deeper theological work and reasons as to like how we get there, but
Right.
like more we could say. But how, when you see someone seeing setting bound, needing even just the need to set a boundary because you have a limitation as being a failure, how would you encourage them to process through that?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's a lot of layers to that.
Mm-hmm.
And to be honest, I think one of the things that's tricky about this work is that like if like I'm sitting with someone in therapy and this is their story where similarly, like it's like, oh man, I wish I could do everything, and because I can't, I'm a failure. What
Mm-hmm.
I would probably do with them is actually just with compassion begin to help them explore, where did you learn
Mm-hmm.
that not being able to do everything made you a failure?
Mm.
Like
Wow.
when is like the early messages, even, and if it's possible, when's the earliest time
Mm-hmm.
you began to feel as though if you weren't able to do everything that equated to failure?
Mm-hmm.
Because oftentimes a belief like that is very early and often young.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times that's about it's an internalized message, and sometimes that might come from the way we were parented.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes that comes from like the system we grew up in, like people were given lots of praise for always pushing beyond their limits, like
Right.
you were ignored if you weren't the best, but if you were the best, you know
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
it's all those implicit messages that they don't even have to be totally verbal. They could
Mm-hmm.
be the way that your parents were with you when they could see that you were like giving 150%. But if
Mm-hmm.
you ever said, hey, like this is hard for me, there
Mm.
were maybe some implicit messages of shame that like,
Mm.
I guess you're just weak in this area, you know?
Right.
It also comes from what we observe from people around us, like our parents, like mentors, like teachers, like coaches. If they might tell you, hey, it's okay to have limits, but if you see them running themselves ragged, feeling as though their value is always tied to their productivity,
Mm-hmm.
that's what happens. We kiddos internalize those messages. I think something like, might be off on the statistic, but something like 70% of all communication is nonverbal.
Mm. Wow.
That's a lot.
Yeah. Holy moly.
Yeah. So a lot of these messages are not always like what was actually said.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of it is how our body experienced the messages and the moments and
Mm-hmm.
the early choices of when you did set a boundary. Were you, like as a kid, were you supported in setting a boundary? Were you shamed? Were you
Mm-hmm.
told you should have tried harder?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and obviously there can be more complexity. Like sometimes that can happen and not happen in childhood, but maybe in your early adulthood where you were in a really high burnout job
Yeah.
where your success always was related to your productivity and you really internalize that can shift
Mm-hmm.
the way that we see ourselves. And so like in my book Try Softer, what the paradox to so much of this is that sometimes when we hear these messages, it's like, let's get going, like I just want to fix this in myself.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's do more.
And so often it's actually, this is the paradox of the work, is that and this is why I'm so grateful to hear how you experienced Try Softer, because that was my hope, is that
Yeah.
people would experience it like a breath of fresh air, a moment to be and to be fully valued for
Mhm.
who they are, apart
Yeah.
from anything that they do.
Mhm.
I often use the language of belovedness, that I really believe like we are beloved by the God of the universe, that we are imbued with a value, with value.
Mhm.
And we can't always access that in every moment, but it's almost like we can learn to live into it.
Mhm.
And part of the way we participate with that is by almost the opposite of trying too hard, is trying softer,
Mhm.
and also is letting ourselves get smaller.
Mhm.
So
So how if someone they're like, okay, I want to do this, I want to make this shift in my life and embrace that being a whole and healthy person also includes having limitations. Like I can't outwork or outthink or out perspective or out strategize my limitations. So, I want to set healthy boundaries. I want to live a healthy life. But whenever I am face to face with my weaknesses or my limitations, I start to feel that shame of just having them. How should someone what can we tell our bodies? What can we remind ourselves in order to keep going on this path of trying softer instead of trying harder?
yeah, yeah. Well, I think, you know, as this is, I feel like the answer people always hate, but I think part of it is just acknowledging that it's complicated, and that it's not, that it's a journey. And,
Mhm.
and I say that not to say that there's not other things, because I have a few other thoughts, but the first story that I tell in Try Softer is about a client who's like, okay, like how long is this going to take?
Mhm. Yeah.
Right. And I mean, like, this is so normal. I've been there when I've been a client, like,
Yeah.
I feel that. So I just want to actually honor that. I want to honor that desire in all of us to make the pain go away. Right.
Mhm.
Like there's something in us, it's very human, that's like, man, this is really uncomfortable. How long do I have to deal with it?
Mhm.
But part of trying softer is we acknowledge, we learn. And it sometimes, the more complicated our stories, the more pain in our history, it can take a little bit of time, but we learn to turn towards our limitations
Mhm.
with compassion.
Yeah.
Almost like, you know, uh, one of the things I talk about a lot in Try Softer is, as we are in a place where we're feeling a little bit more grounded, where we feel a little more like ourselves, we're able to there are different parts of our brain. And when a really important part of our brain called our prefrontal cortex is online, which can only happen if we're sort of a little bit more regulated, we can do something like that's called think about thinking.
Mhm.
So this is sort of a mindfulness strategy. So if you are trying to do this work and you're in crisis, you won't be able to think about thinking.
Mhm.
So the first step is actually to do some things that help you feel a little bit more like yourself. It's
Mhm.
oftentimes I talk about the importance of just getting out, like getting outside and using actual sensory information, like, something you can see, something you can hear, something you can touch. And that just brings us back to ourselves. And
Yeah.
for folks who haven't read Try Softer, I go into that in detail. But once we can think about thinking, what happens is we begin to observe. Like, I'm holding my hand up, like, if this is the pain, right? Like, this is
Mhm.
the pain of recognizing, like, I'm limited. I'm not going to be able to do it all. I'm going to disappoint some people. Um,
Mhm.
I'm probably going to try my best and it's not going to be good enough. Like,
Mhm.
there's going to be some things that are painful. So it's
Yeah.
like, if we can hold that pain and begin to learn to sort of almost internally turn towards that discomfort.
Mm.
And we don't even, sometimes it's like, at first, all that we need to do is just even acknowledge it.
Yeah.
Like, hi, you're
Mhm.
there.
Mhm.
Hey, limitations. Hey, pain.
Yep.
And I say that way because it is that process where, after we sort of learn to we befriend the limitations, we befriend, not that we want to be in pain, it's just that we are. So if we can honor that, as we do that, what happens is we begin to be able to work with it.
Yep.
And we begin to be able to say, like, hey, pain that I'm experiencing, like, what do you need to feel supported in this? And
Mhm.
maybe it's like, oh man, I could really use some outside support. So I'm going to call the friend who is so good about being like, of course you can't do everything.
Right. Right.
Like, okay, let me do that. Like I'm gonna, pull out the letter I wrote to myself the last time I tried to do 100 things, and how
Mhm.
physically, like, it literally made me sick because I did too much.
Yeah.
And I'm going to remember, and I'm going to say, okay, just like someone I care about, like for me, I have 2 kiddos. And sometimes when I need to have compassion for myself, I think about them.
Mm.
And I think about, if they were in that kind of pain, would I want them to just like, nope, push a little harder. Sorry, it's not enough. You
Right.
keep going.
Yeah.
So I sometimes recommend thinking, like, who in your life do you feel compassion toward? And
Yeah.
could you, even just a little,
Mhm.
slice of that compassion and turn it towards?
Yep. Right. That's so beautiful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you bet.